Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most beneficent. This is the traditional way of beginning anything in Islam. And I would like to thank you, Carl, personally for this opportunity to be here as the first Muslim speaker of this series of conferences on science and religion, which I believe is a very important undertaking by Goshen College to enhance our understanding of the relationship that we all have with God and His creation. As you all know, science has now attained the status of a religion, in the sense that most people accept the verdicts of science as we used to accept the commands of God before the rise of modern science. And the relationship between how we understand the reality of our lives, the reality of our relationship with God, with the earth, with the environment, these are all interconnected issues. And I hope to be saying some things about these over the next 3 days that we have together. I'm also very pleased to be here in a smaller town rather than in New York or other places because of the feeling of community that I have already felt. Communities are hugely important, both in our religious traditions and also in the contemporary world. So this feeling of community that I have felt here, I really appreciate that. I would like to begin by giving a very brief overview of the 3 lectures. I've called the series Islam's Quantum Challenge, Living Islam in the Age of Science, in a very thoughtful way. Living Islam in the age of science is a quantum challenge for a tradition which is the tradition of every 4th person now living on earth. And it's a quantum challenge because over the last 300 years or so, the science that we know of has come from a civilization other than the Islamic civilization. This is a very important aspect of the discourse on Islam and science. Because those of you who are familiar with the history of science as a body of knowledge has a history that we trace back to the Greeks, to the Romans, and then with a footnote on the Islamic period, we come to the Renaissance and the modern science. That footnote is something that I would like to expand in my 3rd lecture. But unfortunately, 800 years of a glorious tradition of scientific discoveries has been relegated to a footnote in the contemporary discourse on the history of science. And it has gained currency because during the last 300 years there hasn't been any science in the Muslim world per se. Everything is from another civilization. That would be this would be some of the aspects I'll be talking in my 3rd lecture. But for the first 2 lectures, which deal more specifically with the relationship between Islam, the religion, and science. We'll be focusing on two aspects. The first is tonight is a very difficult night in terms of presenting the question, not even the answer, just the question of Islam and science. Because over the last 17 years, through these conferences and other discourses that you have been listening to, we are talking about science and religion. Science and religion. But very few times, I've been part of this since 90s, very few times we have ever tried to define what do we mean by science and what do we mean by religion. The first one is even more difficult because when we say science, we don't even ask whose science we are talking about, which science, because we all assume there is only one science, that science we know, the science that gives us the cell phone, the science that gives us this and this, we all know that science. So this is the difficult part of tonight's interactions and understanding, and I hope and I pray that we, after an hour or so, we have some indication, if not a grasp, of the complexity of this discourse. The second lecture tomorrow would be more rooted in the Quranic or the Islamic understanding of the cosmology, the cosmos in which we live. And the third lecture, as I said, deals with the challenges that Islamic civilization and Muslims face. And the second half of that lecture deals with technology, the transformation of this earth, the transformation of the way we produce our food, our dwelling places, transformation of the ways in which we interact with each other, communications, all of these. And it's more general than Islam, because I believe our religious traditions face the same dilemmas coming out of the developments in technology. So the second half of the third lecture is devoted more generally to the impact of technology on our lives. To begin with, the first lecture tonight, Understanding the Islam and Science Nexus. And I have called it deliberately a discourse on method. Those of you who are, I know some of you are very embedded in philosophy and history of science as well. Descartes transformed our understanding with this Cartesian duality when he started to systematically doubt everything, and he reached the final degree of doubt that his mind, he was still thinking. So he pinned his existence down to the ability to think. So his discourse on method is a methodological discourse on understanding the nature of reality. My difficulty in presenting this topic is precisely that. How do we understand, how do we frame this discourse on the relationship of Islam, the religion, and science? And we will be exploring the following aspects. The first, of course, is the very nature of relationship. When we say science and religion, or Christianity and science, or Islam and science, what do we mean? What do we mean by these two terms? And what are the frameworks, typologies, that we can use to understand this relationship? Is there a historical dimension to this? When did we start to talk about science and religion in general? Why? What happened? What raised the question? What raised the possibility of even this discourse to start? There is always a historical background to what emerges in a civilization. Now, the question that I want to raise is to take us back to the time of Galileo, for example. See the confrontation that took place between the church and the scientific developments of the time, which framed the discourse in a certain way. The question that we need to think about is, can that particular background, historical background, embedded in the Western civilization in a place called Europe, which is a tiny place on the face of this earth, be universalized to include all civilizations, all kinds of sciences, and all kinds of religions? Is that a valid expansion of the framework? So these are the four major aspects for tonight's. The first, of course, is the formulation of the relationship. Have you ever noticed that we routinely use the word "and" in this phrase, science and religion? What is this "and" doing? I took it out from the heading here and I put a bar here, Islam, science. I didn't want to put the "and" there. But if we think about it, it's a structural relationship. This "and" is making a relationship between two independently conceived entities. We conceive religion as one entity. We conceive science as another entity, and now we have two separate entities and we need to have some kind of relationship, so we say use the word, the preposition "and." Now, this is the difficult part that I was mentioning. Is it possible to break this binary? Is it possible not to have two separate entities, this is a chair and this is a table, and let's make a relationship? Can we get rid of that altogether? Is it possible for science to have emerged from within the religious tradition? One very important historical dimension of this discourse, and I did a lot of research and I searched in hundreds of books written between the 8th and the 16th century. Between the 8th and the 16th century, that is prior to the scientific revolution. And I didn't find a single work devoted to the subject of Islam and science. It was totally absent. Even the discourse did not exist. And when something does not exist, what does it mean? In this case, it meant that intellectual tradition of Islam did not conceive the enterprise of science and Islam as two entities which need to be related by putting a word "and." There is not a single work, and there are thousands and thousands of books on all aspects of knowledge and all branches of knowledge. When you look at fundamental scientific works of those 800 years, everyone would start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, the most beneficent, and go directly into the subject matter. I am writing this book on astronomy because this. No one even thinks of justifying that or conceiving that there is a need to say, okay, I am a Muslim, I believe in Islam, and I'm doing science, and this is the relationship. Nothing. Why and when did we get this dichotomy? And then we made models. We said, well, if we conceive science and if we conceive religion as two entities, then they can be in harmony. They can be in conflict. and some big names would come along and say, these are non-interfering entities, they have nothing to do with it. What does God has to do with science? Forget about God, we are just scientists. So they would say, there is no overlap. These are totally distinct things. If you want to go and pray, go to the church, come to the lab, do your science, and there is no connection. So they broke the essential question of what does science do? That's my next point. What does science do? What do we mean by science? Is there only one kind of science? What is science? And as I said in the beginning, we have become used to saying science and understanding by that the enterprise of studying nature, the natural world, the enterprise that arose in Europe through the scientific revolution of the 17th century as the science, as the only science that we can conceive of. But that's historical myopia. We cannot reduce human history to 300 years or 350 years. Human beings have lived on this planet for who knows how many thousands and thousands and thousands of years. There have been distinct civilizations which have produced their distinct forms of study of nature. And to believe that we have reached the end of science, meaning we have reached the final phase of humanity in the form of modern science, doesn't make sense if we look at the history of science. Science is the organized, accumulative process of gaining knowledge of the working of the world of nature. This is the broadest definition of science that everyone accepts. It's the accumulative and systematic knowledge that humanity has been gaining about how the world in which we live functions. One of the most important aspects of this body of knowledge is how we conceive the subject matter of science, which is the cosmos itself. Is this world made of atoms and molecules? Is it just matter that we are dealing with? This tree from which these chairs and these desks and everything was made, does it have consciousness of the Creator? The mountains, the rivers, the seas, the fruits we eat, the vegetables we produce, are these just inert matter? And we, if we can, manipulate their DNA and change their sequence and do genetic modification so that we can make a few more dollars by putting them on the shelf for a longer period, we carry absolutely no responsibility. We can inject our cows with hormones so that they just stand and produce milk so that we can make more money, because cows are just cows. It doesn't matter what we do to them. We can cut down all the forests. We can destroy the air. We can destroy everything for the benefit of our economy. Is there a relationship between how we conceive the physical world which the sciences study and the enterprise of science itself? Now, is there economy of science? Is there politics of science? Is there sociology of science? Is there a relationship between which projects are being funded at a given time, at a given place? How does science progress? Is it as pristine as we would like to believe that this is just the study of nature, neutral, it has no color, it has no politics, it has no sociology, it has no economics, or is it more than that? How did we get to develop our understanding of the atom that we said one day, oh, we can even break it. And then we can not only break it, but also make it in this atomic bomb that we can even drop somewhere and take out a vast number of human beings in split second, just like that. Is there a relationship between the direction of the progress in science and politics of the time? What happened in the rise of modern science in the 16th and the 17th and the 18th century, and the connections that it developed with the economy? Mr. Boyle discovered the Boyle's law of gases, and someone else came along and said, oh, wait a minute. If I put all the air in this room in a 1 liter container, it has tremendous amount of pressure. What if I run the pistons with that pressure? So he said, you can develop a steam engine. And the government of the time said, well, steam engines go into the ships. And we have ships now which can reach India and Egypt. And we can go there with a huge army and conquer those countries and transform them. Is there a connection between the science of the empire, the science of the time? Obviously, there are deep connections between the science. Obviously, there are conceivably different kinds of sciences. The enterprises of sciences can be different in different civilizations. Each civilization that has flourished on this earth, from the oldest to the present, has a concept of God, a concept of reality, a concept of where things come from and where they are going, a concept of humanity, human beings. And these civilizational concepts drive all things in that civilization: economy, culture, and science, everything. The science that emerged in Europe has now obliterated all other kinds of sciences except for the field of medicine. Except for the field of medicine, where we still have distinctively different philosophies of the human body in the Chinese medicine and in the Islamic medicine and in the Hindu medicine. They conceive this body entirely differently from how modern medicine does, in terms of their diagnosis of diseases and their treatments. That science is still there, and actually it's flourishing, it's coming back. You have all probably heard of the Chinese needles being pinched in the back of some nerves and taking away pain in the stomach. These are not jokes. These are real practices based on the understanding of this body that is totally different from when we go to the doctor here and he says, you have a stomach pain and you take aspirin or you take this medicine for the stomach. Those civilizations have different techniques and different understandings of the structure of the human body. But other than that, we don't have any other science left. But it does not mean that 500 years from now or 1,000 years from now, if the world still survives, this will be the only science. There is a wonderful book by John Maddox. He was the editor of Nature. This book, What Remains to be Discovered, is wonderful in the sense that what we thought, he begins his book by saying that anyone living in the year 1700 would have thought that this revolution that has taken place over the century, over the previous century, has taken us to the end of our understanding of nature. We have discarded this old view that the earth revolves around the sun, and we have reached the limit of our understanding in astronomy. And then it goes on to the 18th century, and the 19th century, and the 20th century. What remains to be discovered? So each successive century has brought us to the understanding of the world of nature that seemed to be full, that seemed to be satisfying and working. And you may all know this already, but if you think of the Newton's laws of physics, at some level, they are still operative. If you are running a steam engine or a big locomotive or a tractor, for example, the Newtonian laws of motion would be sufficient for that machine to work. But at the quantum level, those laws break down. Until the modern science, until the rise of modern science, do you think humanity was incapable of understanding the working of nature? Didn't they produce their vegetables and fruits, and didn't they do gardening, and didn't they move from place to place? Didn't they have modes of transportation? Didn't they give birth to children? Were they not sick and then they were cured? All of these things were happening without them knowing that it's not the earth that is going around. That it's not the sun that's going around, it's the earth that's going around. They didn't know that. But they were still able to have a body of knowledge, a systematic body of knowledge, which is the definition of science, that was enough and sufficient for them to understand. So the point I want to make is that each civilization produces its own science. And now, here is a timeline of developments in science. And this is the footnote I mentioned at the beginning. If we look at the history of science can very safely be compartmentalized on this linear graph of timeline. So we have the early civilizations, then we have the documented Greek civilization, their science, the Romans, the Chinese, the Indian, and then we have this 800 years, a period of 800 years when the best astronomy, the best medicine, the best mathematics, the best chemistry, the most advanced level of geography and other branches of science were within the Islamic civilization. What was that science like? And somebody asked me this question, I think you asked me this question, so what was Islamic in that science? It's a very beautiful question. When we say, and is it possible to say Islamic science? I don't want to expand it to Christian science or Jewish science, but remain focused on this relationship between Islam and science. We need to understand why and when something can be Islamic. When I looked at this beautiful place of worship here, I asked Ron, is there a dome? You see, you have a dome here. I asked, is there a dome on top as well? And he said, no, it's a flat roof. If this building was in Tehran or Lahore or Islamabad or Istanbul, this would be duplicated upwards. Why? Nobody would think of a flat roof there. Why? Why certain architectural forms become important? And what makes a space Islamic or non-Islamic. Because the material used in the construction of this building is wood, bricks, rocks, cement. All the materials are the same. But you can make a casino, you can make a gambling house with the same material, or you can make a place of worship using the same material. So what distinguishes one space from another space is the design, the form, and the function. We can think of Islamic architecture. Nobody would object to say, well, this thing really looks Islamic because it's got calligraphy, it's got names of God written all over the place, it's got this minarets or this dome. When we see a building, we know it comes from a given civilization. We see the cathedrals in Europe, we see the Gothic art, and we say, okay, this is Gothic. We say this is Islam. But when it comes to science, we even say this is Islamic literature. But when it comes to science, then there is this hesitation of saying there could be something Islamic science. And I want to make this point clear. What makes science Islamic, or what makes anything Islamic? In the case of science, if science is a systematic study of the world of nature, if that's the broad definition of science, then the way we conceive nature, which is the subject matter of science, if that conception is rooted in the Islamic worldview, if that conception of the natural world is rooted in Islamic understanding of how this world was created, why it was created, for what purpose this natural world exists, what is the relationship between the person, institution, civilization studying that world of nature and the world of nature, what is their relationship? Then we can begin to understand specific elements of meta-scientific nature which make a distinctive difference between the study of nature that would be done by another civilization. Methods may still be the same. Methods may still be the same. But the conception of the subject is different. And the results would be different. It's a little bit difficult, so I'm going to give you one very specific example. One very specific example from the world of nature. I don't know about how many of you have studied how the bees travel, how much they travel to produce 1 spoon of honey. We all love honey. Honey is full of cure. It's a very, very complex product which exists in the world of nature, and it has existed for as long as we know. Someone from the Islamic tradition studied the beehives in the 12th century and wrote a little book. And he said that, have you ever noticed that the beehives all over the world always make hexagonal structures? The hives are hexagonal. And he asked the question, why hexagons? Why not circles? Why not squares? Why not triangles? There is a beautiful verse in the Qur'an which says that God sent revelation to the bee to travel and make its home and suck the nectar of the fruits and the flowers and create something for humanity in which there is cure. This verse is in the Qur'an. So Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who studied the nature of the beehives in the 12th century, had this verse in his mind when he was studying this construction of the beehives. And he gave this little structure of hexagon tremendous amount of attention, and figured out that bees, the shape of the bee is curved like this. Bees need to make beehive with their own wax, which is not easy. They are not going to go to Home Depot and buy something and make the structure. They have to first produce the material to be. So there has to be economy. There has to be economy in the. So the hexagonal structure is the only structure, only geometric form which can hold the maximum amount of honey using the least amount of bees' wax. And it's the only structure that is the strongest structure that can be stacked one hexagon upon another hexagon. Because if there were circles, the bees would still be able to cover the inside of the circle with the honey, but the circles wouldn't stack. There would be empty space. Therefore, the overall beehive would be weak. If it was a square, then the inner corner of the square would remain empty. Bees wouldn't be able to store their honey in that part, although they would stack and make a very strong structure. So the beehive's hexagonal structures are the only structure, only possible geometric shape which can produce the maximum capability using the least amount of beeswax and be the strongest and store the maximum amount of honey. And then he asked, how did the bees get this? Not only just one species, but all species over this vast empire that was there at that time. There must be some source for that knowledge to have come to them. Now, why would someone in the 12th century be interested in this bee's hexagonal structure? Because there is a verse in the Qur'an, and reflecting on that verse, what kind of revelation the bee received led him to study that. As you know, one of the most fundamental obligation of everyone who is a Muslim is to pray facing towards Qibla, which is the Mecca, which is the house of God in Mecca. This is the Kaaba. Kaaba was in front of the first community when they lived in Mecca. When they moved to Medina, everyone knew that Kaaba is towards the south, so there was no problem. But within the first 50 years of the appearance of Islam, Muslims were in Samarkand, in Uzbekistan now. Samarkand, which is now in Uzbekistan, which is all the way crossing this vast Sasanian empire to Central Asia. And when they arrived there, what did they need to do? Which way is the Qibla? Which way do we pray? I asked Carl yesterday, which way is the east? Because we have to know that. We have to know. So what did they do? They developed astronomy. Because if you could see the alignment of the planets, you can find out the direction of the Qibla, the direction towards which you need to pray. Like in Christianity and Judaism, I don't like to say ism with these religions, but the Jewish tradition as well as Christianity and Islam, they have religious festivals and rites and cycles connected with the movement of the moon throughout the year. We fast during the month of Ramadan. We celebrate certain Easter, for example, is connected with that. So one of the religious obligations led to the science of astronomy in order to understand the movement of the planets, so that people could celebrate and begin and end their fasting and other rituals. The annual pilgrimage, for example, happens according to the lunar calendar. And sometimes it would take 6 months, 8 months to get to Mecca from Samarkand, for instance. So people had to travel in advance. So all of these things contributed towards the emergence and development of certain sciences in Islamic civilization. Does that make them Islamic science? As I said, methodologies of studying, methods and instruments may very well be common, whether they are being done in London or Paris or Mecca. But the objects, the direction of scientific enterprise, and the purpose of study, they are meta-scientific factors. They go into the making of the enterprise of science. Our science now, unfortunately, is the hostage of the market economy. Most of the science today is now profit-driven. It's driven by profit of the large multinational corporations. Most of the science that's happening in the big labs now is either supported by the Defense Department or the pharmaceutical industry. Defense Department has its own needs, and the products that we see in our hands are tertiary, sometimes even fifth generation down the road of the research being done in the labs. So there is a directionality of science driven by economic and political considerations. In the Islamic civilization, the directionality came from religion itself. So I have chosen to replace "and" with "in." So science, instead of science and Islam, it's better to conceive of it as science in Islamic civilization. So that's one aspect of the equation. As I started with saying, when we say science and Islam, we have two entities, science and Islam. We have broken and we have defined science being the civilizational enterprise rooted and embedded within a given civilization. There is no such thing as only one science at all times in human history. Greek science was embedded in Greek civilization, in the worldview of the Greek civilization. The Indian science, the Chinese science, the Islamic science, the European science that now has conquered the entire world. True, there is no denying that it is the only science left. But standing here, I want to say this. I won't be here 1,000 years from now, but we may have a different kind of science. We would still have the accumulated knowledge of this science as we have the accumulated knowledge of Islamic, Greek, Chinese, Indian sciences now. But its goals, its direction, its purpose, its worldview of the subject matter, that is the natural world, would be different. Now, the next point in this equation is Islam. When we talk about the relationship between science and religion, or Islam and science, what is Islam? What is Islam? Because this is science and religion has, as I said, it's a generic term which is empty of content until we fill it with content. And the content is two parts. One, science, which we have dealt with. Second, religion. When we say science and religion, we mean a particular religion. And in the discourse that has happened over the last 50 or so years, since the 19th century actually, that religion has always been Christianity. So the methodologies of relating these two have also come from the same background. But what is Islam in relation to this particular question? I have chosen this hadith of Jibreel, which is an event that took place during the life of the Prophet. And as you know, in Islam, and this is just it's not even 101 Islam, it's like just a quick, brief introduction in relation to our topic. So in Islam, the Prophet and all the prophets that came before Prophet Muhammad, including Jesus and Moses and Ibrahim, everyone received revelation. They received revelation through the agency of an angel. An angel would be the messenger from God to these prophets, in addition to having that, Moses also went to the mountain and had the conversation with God. For Islam, everything that came to the Prophet of Islam came through the angel Gabriel in English, Jibreel in Arabic. One day, and this is a real event witnessed by the companions who were sitting with the Prophet on that day. This is how we know this happened. One day, the Prophet was sitting in Medina with his companions. And this particular companion who has told us this event, his name is Umar bin Khattab. He's the second caliph. He said that a man came, we were sitting in the mosque, a man came, he was wearing white clothes, and they're extremely white. But there was no sign of travel on his person, like there was no dust, there was nothing on, and none of us knew who he was. Just imagine, this is a small community in Medina. Everyone knows everybody. They are sitting in the mosque, and someone comes, nobody knows him. And he said he came and he went straight to the Prophet, and he put his knees against the knees of the Prophet. And he sat very close to him, and he put his hands on his thighs like this. And he said, "Oh Muhammad, tell me what is Islam? Tell me what is Islam." And the Prophet said, Islam is that you say there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his Rasul. Muhammad is his Prophet. And that you pray 5 times a day, and you pay your alms, and you perform your pilgrimage. And the man says, "You have spoken the truth." And the narrator, Umar bin Khattab, says, "We were surprised. This man comes from nowhere and he asks a question, and then he says, 'You have spoken the truth.'" Then he says, "Then tell me, what is ihsan, what is excellence?" And the Prophet said, "Excellence is that you pray as if you are seeing God. And if you cannot do that, then at least know that He is seeing you." And the man says, "You have spoken the truth." Then he says, "Tell me, when is the end of the world?" Because in all our religious traditions, we know there is a time that everyone is going to go away from, everything is going to perish, and there is resurrection and there is afterlife. We all believe. So the man said, "Tell me, when is that?" And the Prophet said, the one who is being asked knows no more than the one who is asking. Because the knowledge of that end time rests with God only. And the man says, "You have spoken the truth." Then the man goes away. And these companions are in a state of surprise. Who was he? Where did he come from? And the Prophet tells one of them to go and bring him back. So he goes out looks everywhere, there is no sign. He comes back and says, I cannot find him. And he said, that was the angel sent by God to teach you your religion. So this is the essence of Islam in a nutshell, that is preserved in our tradition on the basis of this visit of the angel. And as you know, Islam is based on a book, the Qur'an, which is a small text. It's got 77,439 words in it. It's a stable text, meaning the text has remained what it was over the last 1400 years. It's a preserved text in Arabic. It cannot be translated. It has been translated for conveying the message of it, but the actual text remains what it is, and we always recite in the actual. And there are thousands and thousands of people who have memorized the entire Qur'an. The second source is the hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet. And the third, of course, is the intellectual tradition of Islam. So these are our sources to construct the discourse about science. But again, to come towards the end, the object of study of science is the natural world. And how did that natural world come into existence? Based on the teachings that we have in the Qur'an are, number one, that this cosmos was originated by the Creator. So there are three fundamental concepts here in relation to our topic. Number one, the cosmos that was created by God was created as a physical cosmos to be studied, but also as a sign that points to the Creator. I always give the example of this octagonal red sign that you see on the road, which says stop. Everyone follows and obeys. Most people follow and obey. When the stop sign comes, they stop. But they don't say to the stop sign, show me the law. Why should I stop? You are just a octagonal piece of fiberglass. You mean nothing. We understand that there is a law that was enacted in a legally valid institution, and that law is operative on the road. That's why we stop there when we see, because we don't have to go and ask for the law every time we stop. Likewise, the world, the cosmos was created as a sign. This is what the Quran tells us. The sign of God that points to something more than what the nature is. Just like this octagonal sign, stop, is more than what the octagon is. Like it points to a law that is written in a book, the violation of which carries a penalty. So if the world of nature is conceived as created by a creator, then given the command of taskhir is a very complex concept, but one of its meanings is to explore and use and utilize, but not exploit. There is a fundamental distinction between exploitation and utility. The third concept is of Sharia. Sharia is God's will, and the world of nature obeys God's will just as humans are supposed to. The other three concepts are that God is Rabbul Alameen. He is the Lord of all the worlds, not just the natural world or the world of humanity or the animals, but of all the worlds, and there are levels and levels of that. Number two, of Rububiyah, that He is the sustainer. He is the sustainer of the order of existence. Now, we have developed the concept of laws of nature, which is a very problematic concept, to say the least. because we are conceiving nature as lawgiver. These are laws of God. They are not laws of nature. Nature observes the laws. And the Qur'an gives us the examples of the orbits of the sun and the moon, and one cannot overtake the other. Why is there this wonderful harmony in the cosmos? Why we have alternation of the day and the night? The seasons come and go. There is a harmony that is not humanly even conceivable. So this concept of nature is embedded in the teachings of the Qur'an and therefore of Islam. And finally, the last point I want to make is about this khulafa fil earth, this particular vicegerents on earth, stewardship on earth. This is a very, very important concept for the next two lectures as well, but as a whole, for us to understand our responsibility towards the world of nature, which is the subject of science. We are here as stewards. We are not here as the owners. Ownership, legal ownership, speaking in religious terms, legal ownership of the cosmos is not with humanity. We don't own earth. Human beings have drawn lines on maps and created borders and countries and states and say this is America and this is Canada and this is our land and this is your land. Land belongs to God. The earth belongs to God. Everything that is the subject matter of science, the world of nature, belongs to God. We are here to take care of it, preserve it for the next generations, which we haven't done a good job of, and utilize it for our benefits, of course, to sustain our lives and to propagate the purpose for which God created both the cosmos and us. So these are the metaphysical aspects of the enterprise of science, which we often don't want to talk about, because science, the enterprise of science, has excluded metaphysical realities from its enterprise. So I think I have come to the end of my time. If I could just quickly take you through 3 more minutes of the enterprise of science in Islam before the rise of modern science. Which would also be helpful for our second and the third lecture. The geographical expanse of this enterprise of science in Islamic civilization was tremendously vaster than the rise of modern science in this tiny part of the world called Europe. We had makers of this tradition from Persian background, from Arabic background, from the Indian background, from the European background. They spoke a variety of languages and they wrote in a variety of languages. Although the language of intellectual discourse was Arabic, we have many books in Persian, we have many books in other languages. Some of the people who made fundamental discoveries are from this tradition. Al-Khwarizmi, who wrote a book that initiated the science of algebra. Al-Jabr wal-Maqal was the title of his book. The science of algebra comes from Al-Khwarizmi, from that book, which we still have, and is available in translation as well. I would like to end today's lecture with this one person's name and what he did. I went to Uzbekistan 98 and went to this madrasa that Ulugh Beg had established. Now, Ulugh Beg was the sultan or the ruler of Uzbekistan, what is now in Uzbekistan, of Samarkand. It's a fabled city, it's a beautiful city. And there was a Persian whose name was Ghiyasuddin Kashani. This is also beautiful. This is how they did their science. They didn't have the cell phones to tell we are going to synchronize this experiment on this day. So they set the dates to do a certain experiment on at a certain time and a certain day by looking at the planets. They were waiting for the lunar eclipse to happen so they can make their observation. But the story with which I want to end is Ulugh Beg's story of Ghiyasuddin Jamshed al-Kashi. This also is a very instructive story in the sense that it tells us that in the 15th century, this is 1429 when he died, in Samarkand, the most advanced form of astronomy and mathematics or anywhere on earth was in Samarkand. So Ghiyasuddin Kashani arrived there, and he says that the Sultan, meaning the Ulugh Beg, is extremely well-educated man in the sciences of the Qur'an, logic, Arabic grammar, and in mathematical sciences. So he could solve these extremely complex mathematical problems sitting on the horseback. But he put Ghiyasuddin Kashani to test, and he presented to him 4 problems to solve in the presence of 60 or 70 other mathematicians and astronomers. He asked him to determine the projection of 1022 fixed stars on the reed of an astrolabe. I saw the picture of astrolabe somewhere on the posters here. Astrolabe was the computer of that time. It was a versatile tool that was used for many purposes. Number 2 was laying out the hour lines on an oblique wall for the shadow cast by a certain gnomon. 3rd was to construct a hole in a wall so that it would emit sunlight at and only at the time of the evening prayer. To find the radius in degrees of arc on the earth's surface of the true horizon of a man whose height is 3.5 cubits. And he says, by the grace of God, I solved all these problems and earned the respect of the Sultan. I went to this observatory in Samarkand myself, and this 3rd problem that was to be solved was such a complicated problem because of the legal requirements for the time of the prayer. And so all of these things are there to give us an insight into how science was embedded in the religious tradition in Islam. How many links were there, both from the practice of religion as well as from the example of the honeybee that I gave to study the world of nature. I won't go into the details of this decline question right now, but maybe tomorrow or the day after when we have time. It would be interesting to see what happened to that science, what happened to that 800 years of scientific tradition. Why did it die, when, how, and what are the consequences of that? So from here we go, God willing, to the second lecture tomorrow on God, life, and the cosmos in an Islamic mirror. I was told that there is time for a brief question answer. If I still have the internet, I would like to draw your attention to what Carl had said about encyclopedia. This is the site, this is the website for the project. This is the first encyclopedia in any Western language. I don't think you can see it anymore. Can you? It's okay. This is just on the screen, it's not in the PowerPoint. So that's fine. I just wanted to mention that this is a tremendous resource for understanding in specific articles on all concepts, places, events, and things and persons mentioned in the Qur'an. So the concept of nature, for example, what this encyclopedia does is it takes all the verses on a given topic and then the 1400 years of scholarship on that topic to construct a cohesive narrative, because no translation of the Qur'an can give us that overall picture. So I'm thankful to Carl for once more for giving us this opportunity to be together. If you would like to take over and ask questions.
Do you have a movable